I've become sort of, I used to think that, okay, they can't cover everything. And then I realized, no, now I have a much more skeptical and cynical view of it, that what they don't cover is often omission that they want to leave out because that's how they put their finger on the scale. By not covering the story, it doesn't get any attention. Then other times they cover the story and they put their finger on the coverage of it, so it's covered anyway in that way. And it's really unfortunate because as a result, they've lost the faith of most, readers and people who used to watch them on television. And that's why so many independent journalists have, thank goodness, been able to fill the void.
My guest today is Gerald Posner, a journalist and author of several books. We are going to discuss Nazi gender experiments, puberty blocker experiments, the great conspiracy theories of our age, and why the Jews always get blamed for everything. Gerald Posner, thank you for joining me today.
Matt, thanks so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to join you and your listeners.
Let's start at the beginning. You started out as an attorney and came to research and writing through a case that involved surviving twins from the Auschwitz experiments of one Josef Mengele. Of course, when I say that these twins survived, I mean that if either twin had died in the camp, Mengele would have killed the other one for an autopsy. I have a question to you about that book, but first, for listeners who don't know you, can you recap how your career as a journalist began with this project?
Yeah, I was a practicing attorney from 1978, and I left a large law firm that I went to in New York. And was in private practice when I got a call from a friend in the Justice Department who said they'd been approached by some surviving twins of the medical experiments at the largest death camp in the Third Reich, Auschwitz, at the hands of the man nicknamed the Angel of Death, Dr. Josef Mengele, who was doing experiments on them in his pursuit of racial purity. And these surviving twins wanted to sue the German government to get the compensation for the costs they incurred every year for what Mengele had done to them in the camps, just to deaden the pain 30 years later, 25 years later. They also wanted to sue the Mengele family, which was one of the most successful in Germany because they thought that the Mengele family was keeping Dr. Josef Mengele as a fugitive alive and well in South America. I said, great idea, pro bono lawsuit, don't charge for it. It sounds interesting, and little did I know at that time it would become an obsession of mine. And over several years, I would come up with a lot of new information about Mengele. The suit was eventually unsuccessful, and I decided to turn into a book with a co-author from England, and that was the start of my journalism career. I never looked back on the law afterwards.
So you've done a lot of debunking. You're seen as kind of a skeptic, and we're going to talk about conspiracy theories. So why don't you go ahead and take a moment to just tell the listeners what you really think about your own work in that regard. Put it in your own words.
Well, people think of me as somebody who, because I do debunk, and I have debunked conspiracies on some of the most prominent cases, at least in American, modern American history, the Kennedy assassination, the assassination of Martin Luther King. But what they don't realize is I didn't start out either of those projects with the intent of debunking the conspiracy theories. I started out not knowing what my conclusion would be. As a matter of fact, I started out in the early 90s looking into the Kennedy assassination with the bias that maybe the mafia was somehow involved. And I was suspicious of that because the accused assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, was killed 2 days after he was arrested by a man who looks like he's out of central casting in Hollywood as a mafia figure, a nightclub owner in Dallas called Jack Ruby. It raises all the questions about whether Oswald was silenced by some larger conspiracy. It turned out that as I did that research, I've always followed this rule: follow the evidence. Don't reach the conclusion about what you're going to write in your book until you do the reporting. Otherwise, you might as well, if you've already come to the conclusion, it's just bias confirmation. You're going out and looking for the evidence that fits your conclusion. So as a result, I followed that evidence and came to the conclusion that the conspiracies were wrong over a period of time. You could show that, and that Oswald alone had killed Kennedy. When I told that to the publisher, which was Random House, in the middle of my research, they were quite concerned because they thought nobody would be interested in that book. You want to, as a reporter, as a journalist, find the most sensational conclusion you can that's supported by the evidence. I would have been very, very happy to have returned in the Kennedy assassination with the conclusion that convinced all of the mainstream press that there had been a conspiracy in the case because I had found the evidence. But that just wasn't the case. So in the end, you reach the conclusion that history shows you is correct. And people think that because I have debunked conspiracies on those cases and others, like the death of Princess Di, that somehow I must not believe in conspiracies at all. But that's not at all true. I'll believe in a conspiracy. I just need the evidence to show me that. So in my lifetime, I've lived through the conspiracy of the U.S. government lying about Vietnam. I lived through Iran-Contra and the Reagan eras in which there was a real conspiracy. I lived through Watergate, in which there was a real conspiracy, lies about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. So there are any number of times in which I've seen our own government work against the interests of the American public in a conspiracy that they've tried to keep hidden, and then eventually it is unfurled, becomes public, and the documentation is there. So I'm willing to find a conspiracy, but I also debunk a lot of those that are fake because they get going and exist and thrive without any real substance, just on rumors, speculation, and repeated sort of false information.
Yes, and we'll return to that topic in just a moment. Let's start with Erwin Gorbrandt. He performed some gruesome early transition surgeries at Magnus Hirschfeld's Institute. And then he joined the Luftwaffe, and he was involved in medical experiments at Dachau concentration camp. And he's not the only weirdly resonant example of what I will call border science sexology that was going on in Germany at the time. For reasons that don't bear explaining, I have become interested in this moment during the 1930s when German science was embracing supernaturalism. And you've written about another of these figures, a guy who was connected to genetics research rather than sexology, but I would still argue that Mengele was a border scientist. You have written the definitive biography of this man. I remember him being identified after his death. It was a big story when I was a kid. And by that time, his disappearance had left this void that was filled by conspiracy theories and urban legends. I'm thinking of Gregory Peck from Boys from Brazil. So there was always a measure of unreality to the image of the monster. And you humanized him rather effectively, as I recall. I read this book a few years ago because I was curious about the rumors that Mengele did experimental surgeries on the sex organs of twins. And since you have done more digging into his story than any English language writer alive, what was he actually doing? What was the end game for Mengele? Why was he cutting into kids' sex organs? What was that all about?
Boy, you ask one of the most frustrating questions that still has an open door in terms of knowing completely, and that is because Mengele himself did not leave behind any of his paperwork about his experiments. And in Berlin, where he was sending copies of his notations to his mentor, Dr. von Verschuur, at the Racial Hereditary Clinic, those files were destroyed, some of them in the bombings that took place as the Allies came in to take Germany, and some by Verschuur and others who tried to destroy the evidence of what was happening in terms of the experiments. Much of what we can piece together from around Mengele and the reporting around him is that he was very much obsessed with the idea of twins, of course, is an ideal in a very, very callous, cold calculus world. If you're doing experiments on humans, having twins is the ideal situation because one twin acts as the control and the other twin you're doing the experiments on. I believe that Mengele's experiments were largely driven by the idea of being able to prove the concept of not just Nazi racial superiority that he'd gone to medical school on. He was only 32 years old when he went to Auschwitz, very young, up and coming, promising scientist. He wanted to be sort of the father who proved the biology of that in terms of real facts. He was also looking to unlock in some ways the secrets of why, and nobody knows why, an egg splits into two and a woman ends up having multiple, twin births as opposed to single birth. If every good German mother, Aryan mother after the war could have two children at every birth as opposed to just one, they would replenish the war dead at a faster rate. Now, when I say there's still a mystery as to what happened, why Mengele was doing this, after the war, we know this from his own diaries, which were uncovered and I was able to use in the biography on him, that he escaped to the west from Auschwitz. Auschwitz is in Poland. The Russian troops were liberating Auschwitz in January of 1945. The war isn't over until May. All of the Nazis, like Mengele, were fleeing west because they were terrified of being caught by the Soviets, because the Soviets had lost millions of dead from the Nazi invasion, and they were looking for vengeance. The Mengele, after all of that safety, he gets to the West. He gets picked up twice by Americans. We now know. I was one of those who found the files first in the military archives. They release him not knowing what a major war criminal he is. He decides he's going to go back into the East, into Russian-controlled territory, to meet up with a nurse who he had given his medical notes to and some tissue slides about his experiments. It was important enough for him. He may have thought he was going to pick up those experiments at some future date down the road if the Reich came back. So he risked his own life to go back and get that material. We know he got it because he describes in 1949, when he escapes to Argentina finally, that he stopped at the border control by people who are looking at the tissue slides, and he explains them away as sort of this biology matter that he has, and they let him through. And then for 40 years, I've been looking for Mengele's missing notes and suitcase. We haven't found it. So we don't have the final answer. But what I know, he was not working on what I call the sexual science that Magnus Hirschfeld had sort of in the 1930s had it as Institute for Sexual Science, the earliest modern quote-unquote gender-affirming surgeries, that what they called the transvestite passes. And you're right about, Hirschfeld. It's very interesting. But the Nazis ended up just trashing him. They hated him because he was a pacifist. He didn't like war. He was Jewish. His ideas on sexuality to them was wrong. So Hirschfeld is on the outs in terms of Nazi ideology, but Mengele very much in the center of it,
Yes, that's just a great example of how conspiracy theory seems to flow forth from what we don't know. There's a hole in our knowledge, and we fill it up with demons.
As a matter of fact, Matt, one of the things is I find this. It's not a problem I have because I don't mind saying I don't know. A lot of people have difficulty saying that. And people who study a subject, who know it very well, and I've had discussions with them, and sometimes you ask them a question and they have an informed speculation about what they think the answer is to something, but they don't really have the evidence for it, but they'll fill it in as though they know it. That's part of it, I think, a human tendency not to want to say, I don't know, but there's no embarrassment to that. And I think we are stronger as researchers, investigators, journalists, historians, to be able to say the things that we are not quite sure of. You can then speculate about what you think it might mean, but that's where the error is often made. I think, people fill in the gap and they just run away with it.
Let's jump forward to 2020. Your book, Pharma, Greed, Lies, and the Poisoning of America. It became a Showtime documentary.
It was supposed to be, at least it was finished. They spent a few $1 million on actually doing a 6-hour show with R.J. Cutler and 6 different directors, and then it sat on Showtime's shelves for the longest time, and then Showtime gave it back to the production team and said, we're not going to run it. Now, I've looked into, some people came to me with a report that they had some projects that conflicted with that might have been more conducive to the pharma industry, but I've never been able to prove that.
In the first part of the book, you write about the origins of the pharmaceutical industry and the unregulated world of patent medicines. I've written about this topic before because I think it bears on the present. And at the end of the book, you show how the Sacklers, the pharmaceutical family, basically marketed OxyContin in a way that maximized profits at the expense of society. The industry constantly maximizes profits in ways that do not serve our health. So I, as an historian, I like to say that history does not repeat, it rhymes. And you don't mention transgenderism in the book, but I bet you've got a few things to say about history rhyming with gender medicine.
Absolutely. You hit the nail on the head. There's no question. As a matter of fact, there had been, look, it's already, I think with notes in that, Pharma's an 800-page book. The publisher, Simon & Schuster, was wincing already at the size of it. There were some things that got cut along the way, and one of them that got cut was, unfortunately, in a discussion about the right of doctors in America to do off-label dispensing, which was given to them in the late 1930s. The idea was, when there were only a few drugs that were then approved, gee, doctors went to school, they must know everything about the few drugs that are on the market. So if a drug has been approved by the FDA for a specific purpose, cholesterol, lowering cholesterol, treating diabetes, pain relief, if a physician thinks it could be used for something for which it was not approved, they're able to dispense it for that. It's extraordinary power, especially when you then pull back the lens and realize that about half of all the prescriptions in the United States every year are written off-label. One of them that I'd written about in Pharma originally was Lupron, which is the very powerful drug that's marketed by AbbVie and off-label used for as a puberty blocker. That was not in pharma, but as you say, the DNA of the pharma industry, which is about pursuing profits, bottom lines, worrying about what the returns are, that has over time since 2020 become even clearer to me in terms of the gender industry, the pediatric gender industry and the trans adult industry as well, in terms of the pursuit of profits by companies both for medicines like puberty and hormone blockers, cross-sex hormones, often dispensed for reasons for which they were not approved, and the surgical interventions, which have continued to expand at a somewhat alarming rate.
You've done some research and writing on your Substack about youth medicalization. In fact, you've had your post about your op-ed in the New York Times, The Truth About Puberty Blockers, pinned to the top of your Substack for 3 years, which speaks to commitment, sir.
Well, it speaks to the fact that I assume, two things. When the Wall Street Journal ran that piece and I sent it into them, I'd never published in the Wall Street Journal before. So I didn't have a relationship with them, Matt. It's not a situation in which I say, I knew the editor there. I knew that editor would look on this subject kindly. I sent it to them after the New York Times was not interested. I thought maybe the Journal. I was looking for a mainstream large publication to be able to publish this sort of warning story about puberty blockers. So when they published it in 2023, it was great because we had had a lot of discussions already online and independent reviews and groups and had already talked about it extensively, but it hadn't yet made what I call the mainstream press. That op-ed was cut down from maybe 1,500 words to 800. So it's the process of doing an opinion piece in a major paper. You lose things you otherwise like. But I keep it there as a pinned because many of the people who discover me, I don't stay on one subject. So I'm not writing all the time about the problem with pediatric gender medicine. And sometimes I'm talking about what's happening with Iran, and other times I may be talking about conspiracies or the Kennedy assassination. People find me for different reasons. When they come to that Substack, I want them to see that story because although I've covered a lot of different things since then, that's a story they may not have seen. They missed it the first time out, and it might start their own inquisitive look into the topic because people come to me for reasons completely unrelated to gender. And then if they see that, they may start to look a little wider into the gender issue.
We've all had to become experts against our will. I mean, I never wanted to spend any time arguing that women exist and kids are not adults. How has your understanding of the word transgender changed in the last decade? And what changed your thinking? What is your peak trans story?
The so for me, it sort of just began in terms of my wife, Trisha, who often is leading the way on different subjects, started to watch, and this goes back years ago now, some early Gen Spect on YouTube. And she would watch these interviews on Gen Spect and say to me, you really have to watch this. It's remarkable. And I would say, Trish, I'm, working on something else. I'm doing this or whatever else. And then around the same time, a family member, she'll remain unnamed, the cousin, started their own journey into the world of gender and fell into the rabbit hole and has had over that period of time, I've watched that turn out into be a fairly, unmitigated disaster of sorts. And so I had a personal involvement of being able to see it. And then Trisha's initial interest, which then started me to look into it. And then I found, as you say, the pharma connections, as I call it. So I write about this in pharma. There's an entire multi-billion-dollar business that is built up in which pharma needs an ally. The ally, often for them on mind medications, on psychiatric medications, on psychological medications, is the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. The DSM, sort of it's the Bible used. Once something is listed in the DSM as a condition, then of course pharma companies and clinicians and doctors rush to treat it. It has the okay because it gets approved by insurance in the United States, which is absolutely critical. So this has happened in terms of anxiety and depression with the drugs like Valium in the 1960s, when anxiety attacks and panic attacks were enveloped in 1980 into the DSM. Xanax was able to focus on that and became the number one selling drug. You see it time and time again. And we talk about transgenderism. Boy, the DSM is the perfect thing to follow. The first DSM comes out in the 1950s, doesn't even mention the word gender. You can go through the entire thing, it doesn't exist. And then they end up doing the next edition doesn't come out until 1968, I think it is. And there they talk about gender as a, quote, and I'm quoting here, sexual deviation in adults. So quite different than what we have today. And then it sort of evolves. 12 years later, in 1980, you get the third edition of the DSM, and all of the clinicians and pharma companies are waiting for something to happen. And here they finally talk about transsexualism. And then they talk about it as a psychological disorder, by the way. They don't talk about it as having anything to do in terms of it's a desire to live the another way, but it's not in terms of surgery or medicine. It's not until 2013, people often don't realize this, you get the words gender dysphoria in, and it becomes a condition, and it's applied to minors in 2013 for the first time. And then, Matt, the floodgates open. You can start to see the difference. I mean, there was one gender clinic in the United States that was existing from 2003 up in Boston. As we're talking today, there are 60 of those clinics around the U.S., 350 doctors' offices in that providing it. So it's a growth business. In terms of the off-label drugs like Lupron and other gender blockers, puberty blockers, it's become a $700-800 billion a year business without any FDA approval. So I look at the floodgates having opened, the way that the medical community waited for the DSM to open that, and then once it was, they jumped in.
There's a true crime book in the fraud angle. So let me pitch you on this book idea. Just as an exercise. Because I'm already writing the book, you don't have to. Uh, uh, in 2018, I was at Netroots Nation, which is the largest conference of very online progressive people in the world. And I heard presenters talk about the plan to turn Planned Parenthood into youth gender clinics. And then 7 years later, I was at the Federal Trade Commission to hear witnesses testifying to their experiences with sex rejection medicine. And at both of these events, people described how the practitioners bill insurance companies for endocrine disorders instead of gender dysphoria. That's the amazing part about all this. I heard about this in 2018, and I thought, that sounds like fraud. And I got up and I more or less walked out of the Democratic Party. Because, yeah, it was fraud. And the point of this fraud was not only would they send the insurance company a bill and the insurance company wouldn't care, but the parents would not know if the 16-year-old went to Planned Parenthood and got testosterone. I'm not a lawyer, but that sounds very sketchy, sir. So in 2025 at the FTC panel, Dr. Eitan Haim of Texas, the whistleblower that the Bidens prosecuted, I've interviewed him before. He explains how clinicians are doing this thing that I heard progressive activists talking about 7 years before, and it's fraud. So I am tracking this case because I sort of got bookend history of it personally. And I'm quite sure that Glenna Goldis is involved in the case, and I pity the fools that come under her cross-examination. So granted that you haven't been a courtroom lawyer very much lately, what's your take on that case, on sort of the broader legal front too, as an informed observer with an understanding of the law? How is transgenderism faring in the courts?
No, I will tell you. So it's on multiple fronts, and what you just talked about a moment ago, Matt, is absolutely, I think, critical. I wish sometimes, you say to me, "What do you wish?" I wish I had. I say this all the time to Tricia. We're a two-person operation. We sort of go into a subject, then we do a deep dive, and we try to get it. And then occasionally we say, "Gee, we wish we had a team of investigators because we go after X, Y, and Z." One of the things I'd be going after, and I'm hoping that some other good media group, Free Press, Barry Weiss, whatever, is doing this, is I think last year the Department of Justice, sent out a group of subpoenas on the very issue that you're talking about to these physicians and major clinics, sort of looking for fraud, false statements in terms of how they were disguising gender affirming care, because that becomes, in a legal sense, putting my lawyer's hat on, a False Claims Act. You get a False Claims Act, it's easier to prove in some ways for the government. And I believe now, you said, before I said don't say something unless you know it with certainty. My informed speculation based on the research that I've done so far is that there is a significant fraud issue in this country by clinicians of gender affirming care for minors, especially for minors, and in some cases for adults, who have tried to avoid scrutiny at their hospital systems, or they are in Republican states that are not friendly to the entire area, and they don't want to have a spotlight on them. And so they have done exactly what you described that you had seen years ago, and that is misidentify the diagnosis, put it under something else, hide it so it doesn't pop up as gender. So the numbers that we talk about often that are alarming about the growth of actual medical procedures that leave children, with irreversible, lifelong consequences and sterility are underreported, if anything, because we're not always getting the accurate numbers. There's no doubt that that's a major fraud case. And on other fronts, we have in this administration, I don't care, I will talk to people friends of mine who can't stand, for instance, the Trump administration. They have some gripe with him about X, Y, or Z. And I try to take them to an issue on which I think we can have common ground. And that's often on the issue of gender ideology. So the Trump administration is fighting the good fight here. The FTC has gone ahead and brought actions that could change the way that we consider this, because they've sued WPATH, which is the primary organization that a lot of people rely on, a lot of clinicians and doctors and medical associations rely on for advice, and sued them for false advertising, for essentially making false claims. The FTC is saying that they've said that in 2022, when WPATH went ahead and removed age limits for the amputations of healthy young breasts on girls and penises on boys, that they removed those age limits without any medical reason to do it, and from pressure from Rachel Levine, who was the man who had been a transgender admiral, the first in American history under the Biden administration. There are a series of claims in here that are absolutely critical. WPATH is fighting that. They've gone to Washington court to say to a judge, this is a First Amendment issue. The FTC has no control over medical claims. This should be, stayed. That's being fought out as we're talking now. But I'm hopeful that that litigation survives the motions to dismiss, and we will get to discovery before the end of the Trump administration. And in that discovery will be the evidence of how the people who have led this field as advisors and clinicians and thought leaders in WPATH and other major transgender organizations have known that the very surgeries and hormonal treatments that they have recommended enthusiastically had a whole sidebar of often life-changing and irreversible consequences. They ignored that information, they buried it, and that will open them up to significant litigation. I don't just say that as speculation, because Michael Schellenberger, when he got access to the WPATH files, was kind enough to give them to me beforehand. So I was able to write an article when those files came out, when he did his work with Mia Hughes, and Mia wrote a great article. I wrote in the New York Post about that. I saw firsthand in the internal files of that organization the degree to which Marcy Bowers and other top officials of WPATH knew, discussed the downside, the side effects, and the real risk to these procedures, and then for public consumption, ignored all of that, put it in the back room, and encouraged children to go ahead and do it. It's a disgraceful story.
Switching gears, I read Case Closed, your book about the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and I put it right up there with Norman Mailer's book. It's necessary to read this if you want to engage at all with the facts about Lee Harvey Oswald. If you want to do conspiracy theories, you probably need to start with the most solid debunkings, and understand what you're working against. My own take, and you are free to respond, is that Lee Harvey Oswald was a communist, and that created a cognitive dissonance for the left. The myth, and it is a myth, it has no foundation. The myth that Kennedy would have absolutely stopped Vietnam, that is a leftist myth. And it had to come with the denial that a violent radical leftist was responsible for his assassination. You can look around today and you can see Roger Stone and other right-wing or conservative people who are into JFK assassination conspiracy theories. But I maintain that it was the need for a leftist saint, the Kennedy who could have prevented Vietnam, that really drove the conspiracy theories. And in no small part, that's because the government lied so much during the Vietnam era. Oliver Stone, in particular, is someone who seems really politically shaped by that idea. The lone shooter is sort of unsatisfying for grander narratives of history. And we see right now how the truth about Tyler Robinson was not satisfying to Candace Owens. She needed a much bigger, more fantastical epic in which she was the main character. So what is your take on the conspiracy theory itself? The conspiracy theory around the assassination of Kennedy has a history, and you show how that was already under construction from basically the beginning, which, was eye-opening. I really enjoyed that part.
Well, I agree with your analysis and summary of it. I mean, I think that the most important part, people sometimes say to me, Matt, what's the single thing that convinces you it wasn't a conspiracy? And I don't have an easy answer for them. What convinces me is Oswald. Studying Oswald, third 40% of Case Closed is a biography of Oswald, and in many of the conspiracy books, you read about them. You read the books, and Oswald's a sort of a cipher, a footnote. He's a stick figure who you just don't know anything about him, and you assume that this just turned 24-year-old kid could not possibly have done it. I mean, there is this cognitive dissonance. We talk about this in terms of conspiracies. People don't like the fact that a famous individual, it could be killed by someone as insignificant as Oswald or Sirhan killing Bobby Kennedy, or James Earl Ray, a four-time loser criminal killing Martin Luther King. We want something bigger on the side of the killer. It makes us feel that life isn't as random. A conspiracy does that very nicely. If the CIA had to get together, or the KGB, or Castro, who knew that the CIA was trying to kill him with the mafia, had to first kill Kennedy, it doesn't make you feel better about Kennedy's death, but it gives some meaning to his death. And people strive for that psychologically and look for that. And I think you also, though, hit a very important aspect when you say that Oswald was, in fact, no question a communist. He had his own unusual, mixed with a bit of anarchism, his own unusual political theory. But that's why the first response that said, no, this can't be, came from other communists or leftists. So the very first book that was done was a book called Who Killed Kennedy? It was based on press accounts by Thomas Buchanan. He was an American communist living in Europe. It was filled with all types of false statements, but the very first book on the assassination that said, no, it's a conspiracy, done by an American communist. And then in 1966, a few years later, you start a series of books called Whitewash by Harold Weisberg. He is a former Senate investigator who had been dismissed for leaking information to the press, a hardcore leftist. And even the most famous of those early books, Rush to Judgment, a great title, by a New York attorney, Mark Lane. Mark Lane, also a committed leftist. Their immediate knee-jerk response was, oh, it's a communist who you say killed Kennedy. That can't be true. It has to be the opposite of that. They must have set him up. And you're right. They look at all parts of history and assume that it would have turned out better and different without any reason to know if that's the case. The very last thing on this, I do think the Kennedy assassination, there's legitimate reason to have doubts from the very beginning, and that is what I mentioned earlier, Jack Ruby, the nightclub owner's murder of Oswald. Look, if Sirhan, who killed Bobby Kennedy, had been killed 2 days after he was arrested by somebody with ties to an American nationalist, right-wing nationalist group, or if James Earl Ray had been killed 2 days after he had been finally apprehended by somebody with ties to the Ku Klux Klan, we'd all be looking at those cases thinking from the start, looks like a conspiracy. They're silencing him. So I do think that Ruby does more harm to history than anybody else. If Oswald had gone to trial, even if he had said, I'm not innocent, and he had fought it, and the evidence had been presented, the ballistics evidence, the eyewitness testimony, the evidence from his own wife about how he had tried to assassinate a retired U.S. Army general only months before. If he had been convicted, he would have gone away. And even if he continued to protest, as James Earl Ray continued to lie for years and said, I didn't do it, you have the wrong person, there would be some who would listen to him. He'd have a small group of fans, as Luigi Mangione has his fan base, but very, very few. It would have been a different case.
So you think Oswald would have been like the assassin of Martin Luther King, James Earl Ray? You think he would have done the same sort of thing and made up stories if he had lived?
The reason it would have been, and again, so I based upon what I know of Oswald, the reason I believe that would have been the case is Oswald loved the limelight. He always thought he was smarter than he was. He was clever, but he thought he should be the center of attention. He had put himself into the history books by being able to pull off the assassination of JFK. And in prison, he would have had, and during his defense, people like Mark Lane, the New York attorney, and others coming to him and saying, by the way, you know these pictures that they've introduced of you, Lee, standing in the backyard of the place that you were renting in Dallas, holding the gun that was later tied ballistically to assassinating the president to the exclusion of every gun in the world, in which you were holding, a copy of the Militant and other left-wing papers, and you had the pistol on you that later was used to the exclusion of all of the guns to kill a Dallas police officer after the assassination. We think the shadows are a little off on that. Maybe it really wasn't you. They would have fed him 1,000 possibilities, as they have in these conspiracy books, to be able to say, oh, yes, thank you. He only would stay relevant, Matt. He only would stay the center of attention if he continued to say it was something larger than me, as Ray did with his mysterious Raoul figure, until I tracked down Ray's Raoul and found out that it was just a fake story. So I think that they often continue to hold on to this idea because it keeps everybody in that guessing game. They've pulled off the act. They have the satisfaction of having done that. And now they're going to drive everybody crazy with the idea that it was something else.
You wrote one of the definitive books on 9/11, Why America Slept. It's been ages since I read that book, but what I recall is that you basically concluded the attack could have been prevented. But that the prevention mission was not a priority. The CIA and this FBI can't get along. The administrations turn over. Knowledge gets lost. The allies are not really as helpful as we want. The biggest charge you made was that Al-Qaeda had a closer relationship with the Saudi royals than anyone had known. That was according to Abu Zubaydah. Now, at the time, you did not know when you wrote that Abu Zubaydah had been tortured at black sites.
Right.
Now, my own opinion, having studied this gruesome question, is that information obtained under torture is just not reliable. And
Right.
I'm not absolving the Saudis. I'm not absolving them at all. That's just my 2 cents about that. And this is just one detail of a much larger book that has a lot to say about media distractions and intelligence turf wars. I found it very interesting. But this biggest controversy about the book, I think, speaks to the overreaction. Dick Cheney's 1% option, where preventing another terrorist attack, even if it's only a 1% chance of happening, that becomes the only mission, and that went too far in the other direction. What's your take now with hindsight, given all the information that has come out since 2003, everything that has happened since? Looking back on all of that, what is your opinion now?
So there's absolutely no question that 9/11 could have been prevented. And I hear still former government officials say it was impossible to prevent because it was taking place in real time and the elements of it weren't together. That's clearly false. I have a damning case presented in terms of the evidence from the FBI and the CIA about how they weren't communicating with each other, how the CIA had followed two of the hijackers who ended up on the planes on 9/11 into the country in 2000, knew that they had been at a terrorist conference in Malaysia, never told the FBI about them until August of 2001 when there was chatter about a terror attack. Nobody could find them then. They were living openly in California under their real names, yet California driver's license. Nobody put them on a no-fly list for the FAA. They made the reservations for 9/11 in their real names, not to even talk about what was happening in Minneapolis and other places. So, yes, it's easier Monday morning to put it all together and say, oh, this is the information you should have looked at in a flood. I understand why it was missed, but it could have been prevented. The other thing is, I totally agree that the use of torture is a path you go down, well, that you get bad information, false information. People eventually tell you whatever you want to hear. The gamble for Cheney and others was that they thought they might come up with, you said, the 1%. Somebody might say, okay, all right, there's a dirty bomb that's going to go off in New York City or in Washington, D.C. 5 days from now, and I'm going to tell you where it is. Otherwise, it's going to spew radioactive material and make a 6 square mile area unlivable for 10 years. If they had come up with that, Matt, then nobody would be questioning the tactics used. They'd be saying, oh, brilliant. My goodness, you were able to do that. You only had to essentially knock their eye out and pull their ear off. But thank God you saved all those lives in Washington. I'm being sarcastic, but what I mean by that is there was no next leg. So as a result of that, and we know that, they don't even have that to hang on when they talk about the use of torture. And you're right about Zubaida, but the interesting part about Zubaida is that what I talk about is a false flag operation, which was right before they started to do the serious torture with him. He lost an eye and all. And that is where they pretended that he was in Saudi custody because they thought that the Saudis wanted him, would execute him, and he might be afraid of the Saudis and actually be more cooperative with the Americans. It turned out, I want to know this, even assuming he was wounded when we picked him up in 2003, in 2002, they were using pain on and off with medication. They were already depriving him. They were using these torture techniques. How did he know the private cell phone numbers of 3 Saudi princes? And how did he know the private cell phone number of the head of Pakistan's Air Force, Musharraf Ali Mir? And why, when the U.S. told the Saudis and Pakistanis about that information, unable to figure out what it meant, those 4 ended up dying within a few months of each other, one of complications from surgery from liposuction, one in a single car accident the day after that while on his way to the funeral of the first one. One, according to Saudi royal, a 25-year-old died of thirst 55 miles outside of Riyadh. And the head of Pakistan's Air Force, his plane blew up with his wife and his military adjutants on board in an explosion that no one's ever solved. Now, here I am, the person who debunks conspiracies, and I don't know if it's a conspiracy or a coincidence, but I know that I am suspicious, and the anger that I have is the failure of the United States and the mainstream press to investigate that. They have consistently ignored it. The CIA behind the scenes has trashed that story and said, oh, it's just not true. And I say all the time, all right, let's determine if it's true. Why don't we ask Zubaida? Because Zubaida is still at Guantanamo Bay. He has not been put on trial. I don't know, after all these years and the beatings that he's had and everything else, what he thinks, what he knows, or what he remembers. But there are ways to find this out. And the last point on this is, at one point publicly, I had asked for the CIA to release the interrogation tapes of Zubaida, the early interrogation tapes. Let's see what he said about these cell phone numbers in the Saudis. And they then announced in 2009 that they had destroyed a series of tapes in a normal process of record keeping of Zubaida and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the mastermind of 9/11. So those tapes are gone. The videos are gone. There's everything in me as an investigative journalist that tells me something is rotten in the state of Denmark here.
Ooh, the mainstream press ignoring a story. Why, that sounds just ridiculous. That never, ever, ever, ever happens.
the I think I've become sort of, I used to think that, okay, they can't cover everything. And then I realized, no, now I have a much more skeptical and cynical view of it, that what they don't cover is often omission that they want to leave out because that's how they put their finger on the scale. By not covering the story, it doesn't get any attention. Then other times they cover the story and they put their finger on the coverage of it, so it's covered anyway in that way. And it's really unfortunate because as a result, they've lost the faith of most, readers and people who used to watch them on television. And that's why so many independent journalists have, thank goodness, been able to fill the void.
And one of the effects of that is that people become distrustful. And so they turn to conspiracy theories, ironically enough. So the press actually makes things worse in this way. What's interesting here, too, is that most 9/11 conspiracy theories are really dumb. You've identified one that's not. But anyone who has ever seen the video from, I think, about 2006 is one of the first YouTube videos that went viral. It was a man who put steel rebar into a forge and he heated it up far below the melting point and then demonstrated how he could bend the rebar with his pinky finger because it was so soft. It gets pliable far below the melting point. So this whole point about, the steel could not have melted is just wrong.
Right.
You've got pieces of airplane on the ground in front of the Pentagon that's still on fire, and people are saying, oh, no, no, this is all fake. It's all, whatever. My own feeling then, and I think it was validated over the years that followed, is that everyone everyone understood immediately that the United States was going to do some military stuff. And they were sad about it. And they explained it with cockamamie stories. And the dumbest of those stories is the one where the Jews were all told to stay home because Israel had secretly filled the building with explosives and the planes were holograms and there was a spaceship and it just got so dumb. And for too many of these dumb people, only the Jews, the all-powerful Zionist conspiracy to rule the world, could have planned this elaborate false flag operation. So what is your take? Why did 9/11 get blamed on the Jews instead of the Muslim terrorists who flew planes into buildings?
No, you're right. I think it gets blamed on two different groups. One is the CIA. So we pulled it off, right? Somehow America pulled it off because Bush wanted to go to war on Iraq and he's just itching to do it. And therefore it was a false flag operation. And the reason people like me are just dumb because we do the research and say, hey, you could have prevented 9/11, but don't you realize those conspiracy people would say to me, they didn't want to prevent 9/11. That's part of the plot. So they view it as sort of this overarching Oliver Stone type plot. And then the Jews did it, of course, becomes part of what we hear today consistently, post October 7th in Gaza, which is, the Jews must have done it because they're so diabolical. The telephone calls that told them not to come into work, although among the 3,000, there are plenty of Jews who didn't get the call because they died that day. But the interesting thing is we went to war against Afghanistan, against the Taliban, which is an enemy of Israel because they want the destruction of Israel. We went to war then against Iraq and Saddam Hussein, which was also saber-rattling against Israel. So they turn it to say, America is fighting Israel's wars. And we're fighting Israel's wars because Israel seduced us into the war by staging 9/11. Boy, that is a level that makes even the false flag operation the CIA did it, the American secret government did it, pale in comparison. I'm not Jewish, but I write often about anti-Semitism and other matters. And I find it amazing. I say that when you get down to the nub, you run out of conspiracy theories on other things. Often it becomes the Jews did it. It became that very early on 9/11.
Now, I need to take a minute and say this. I have to get this off my chest. Please bear with me. The birth rate in Gaza was unaffected by this war. In fact, every war going back to 1947 has failed to stop Gaza from becoming 26 times as populous today as it was in 1947. So I asked Grok, and it turns out that in the United States, only a big Sunbelt city like Phoenix, a place that didn't exist in 1950, has grown by the same proportion in America. And of course, that was through in-migration and not birth rates. So what Hamasabus and Gaza genocide protesters are basically asking me to believe is that a city like Phoenix happened in the middle of a Holocaust zone. And then there's Operation Grim Beeper. I don't know if you're aware of this, Gerald. I did the research. The mass text message to those Hezbollah pagers had a lower death rate than the first generation of police tasers used in the United States.
I did not know that.
Yes, the devices were precisely designed to injure people and to put them in the hospital with crippling injuries that put them out of the fight and turned them into burdens. That was deliberate. A country that deliberately uses less lethal ammunition on its enemies is not doing genocide.
You're saying, Matt, I will tell you that I sort of marvel at the fact that Trisha, my wife, my all these years from Mengele on, she's been here researching with me, said to me early on when the genocide claims were being made, you, meaning to me, should write about this. And I said to her a number of times, Trish, it's not worth the effort because no one's going to believe the genocide claims. That shows you what I know and don't know, as that's become sort of a monitor. And you're very interesting. I think about this in a number of ways. Jews have an overrepresentation in terms of achievement, let's say Nobel Prizes. But I cite this all the time. They make up about 0.2% of the global population. They've won over time from 1900 to through like last year, 22% of all individual Nobel Prizes. But somehow they can't figure out how to do genocide. The same people are so bright, have all these breakthroughs on medicine, cancer, everything else. They can't figure genocide because it's not just what you were talking about. In 2005, when they leave the Gaza Strip and Hamas takes control in a fight with Fatah, the population of the Gaza Strip then is estimated by the UN and everybody else, and the UN is suspect, but let's take their figure, 1.3 to 1.4 million. Today, even with the displacement of people leaving to go back to families in Jordan and other places, which has happened, it's the lowest is 2.1 million. So we've had a 50% increase on the population of Gaza at a time when Israel supposedly has a policy of genocide in place. So it's one of those situations where the common sense of it you have to ask, but I do think there's more at play here. I wrote a piece together with Tricia in Skeptic magazine recently called The New Normal for Anti-Semitism, in which I talk about anti-Semitism on the right, which is sort of the traditional Jewish view, which is Jews are omnipotent and they lead us into wars and there's a secret cartel that controls the world, and anti-Semitism on the far left, which is sort of Israel is an apartheid racist colonial empire, and it's a virtue that we must have to oppose it. And genocide becomes a calling factor in that. So you say genocide, you say it's taking place. Kids and others don't know what genocide actually means. And by doing it, if you really truly are anti-Semitic or you want to cause a disturbance or you want to be devious and diabolical in your arguments about Jews, that is sort of Holocaust inversion. You've turned the genocide on its head. So instead of the last genocide that we remember in modern history being the effort to eradicate the Jews of Europe by the Nazis, a real genocide that didn't succeed in its entirety, but certainly was very effective from the Nazi viewpoint of killing millions of Jews. You now have replaced it with the genocide of Palestinians, quote unquote genocide. And that Holocaust inversion, turning the Israelis into the Nazis of the modern era, just adds insult to the injury.
I think you make an important point. I mean, what is Queers for Palestine exactly? When those Queers for Palestine talk about the trans genocide, what is that really about exactly? We seem to be surrounded by fake genocides. We had Black Lives Matter and the supposed genocide of black men by police. We had, empty pits around a Canadian residential school that were supposedly a mass grave. And there have been, no bodies come out of that ground. So we have fake genocides all around us. It's almost as if someone is trying to cheapen the term genocide.
I agree with that. But I think that, Matt, on this issue, you're talking about genocide, we're talking about Israel, Gaza. There's something I talk about, and Tricia is Jewish, and she's followed anti-Semitism for years and has a thing called Anti-Semitism Watch. And what she points out to me all the time, when Italy, fascist Mussolini invaded Ethiopia in the 1930s, people didn't go around and beat up Italians. And there was a pedophilia scandal in the Catholic Church. People don't go out and beat up Catholics. Even when Russia was invading Ukraine and carrying out what we thought this modern war of aggression, Yeah, some Russians couldn't compete in international competing events, but people weren't going down the streets finding Russians who had grown up and were first and second generation British or American and attacking their businesses and saying, I'm going to boycott your local deli. That is happening, though, with Jews because people are using the genocide and the monitor about Israel, and they don't like Netanyahu. But then they transfer that sort of easily that Jews are stand-in for Israelis. They make no distinction between it. So that a Istanbul bookstore had a sign that said "No Jews allowed." It didn't say Israelis. That would be bad enough, but Jews. And so I think that in this instance, some of the boycott efforts, the what I see on campuses, the calling out, the attack on people who are visibly Jewish in the medical, services or others, it changes the equation. And it goes back to what you were talking about when you said Jews being blamed for 9/11. They make an easy target. And in this sense, that conflation of Israelis and Jews, I think, is particularly pernicious.
Before the 7th of October is even over, there are protests, there are signs printed, there's a unified message that Gaza is being genocided. Never mind the pogrom we just did. Everyone has to stop Israel from genociding Gaza now. And it's been a steady drumbeat ever since. Stop the imaginary genocide of Gaza. So catch us up on what you've learned about how this happened in the very first hours. It seemed like AstroTurf. You've been looking into it. Catch us up.
So, the best work I've seen recently on this was about a week ago, a report put out by NGO Monitor, and people can find it online. It's their latest report, and they sort of looked into in the UK experience. We're going to be finding, I think, I'm looking into this with some other people, a very similar rollout in what happened in the American experience. But how was it that all of a sudden on October 8th, there was these mass demonstrations were taking place? It started with pre-printed signs that talked about genocide. And I think that the NGO Monitor, sort of is very interesting. They talk about the organizations, these sort of 40, a group of 40 that had really, it undercuts entirely the idea of a grassroots, spontaneous demonstration. They were primed for something large. October 7th was that event. 30 of the 40 groups aren't even registered charities. More than a dozen of them operate outside of any UK regulatory framework, same as the US here in terms of getting public donations. Some of them, nearly half, believe it or not, get UK government funding, which would infuriate me if I was a UK taxpayer. And they also get funding from major progressive organizations in the US, like George Soros's Open Society and the Rockefeller's Group. Now, all of that provided millions of dollars to what became a very organized response on October 8th and continued to gain speed as the contagion grew. And Trisha the other day printed a picture on Twitter of Avilia Chevalier, who is, for those who don't know it, a candidate who won the Democratic nomination in New York recently, beat a 5-term congressman, is a member of the Democratic Socialist of America. Very, anti-Israel, talks about genocide. As the Democratic nominee in that particular district, she will win in November and go to Congress. Tricia put up a picture of her on October 8th, 2023, the day after the largest slaughter of Jews since the Holocaust, 1,200, which Americans often forget. If you're in America, it would be the equivalent of 40,000, much smaller population. So stunning, 9/11 times, several times over for Israel. The next day, she's on the street at a demonstration in New York City. The sign right behind her head says genocide is racism, pre-printed, right off the printing press. They didn't do it the night before. She's tried to walk that back a little bit and say, I'm there because I'm concerned about all civilian deaths, et cetera, yada, yada. But the key is people were attracted to those rallies, and I'm not saying that those people who showed up were the ones who were organizing it, paying for it, and arranging it, but they were sort of the useful idiots that then expanded as more and more were attracted to it over time. It's a very organized rollout.
Yes, it's interesting how you don't really have to be a conspiracy theorist to be able to discern patterns and say, oh, something's going on here. We should probably know more. And that's where real investigative journalism begins.
When you say investigative journalism is important, you're absolutely right. But it's almost a fire hose of information, Matt. There's almost too much. For those of us who are independent reporters who try to do it, it takes, people only see the end result of what we report in an article for 1,500, 2,000, 3,000 words. They don't know about the weeks of work that you do in which you're trying to get somebody to talk to you on the record or off the record. You're trying to get sources to confirm something you've seen in a document. There's all this background work. It's time consuming, and I'm not complaining about that. That's what I do for a living. But I'm frustrated sometimes that you feel, even as an independent journalist, you're only making a small dent here or there. There are so many topics of interest that you'd like to be able to spend more time on and do a deeper dive on, but there's a limit. It's a fire hose of news coming at us.
Boy, howdy. Having worked this beat for a few years, I can say that is absolutely true. So let's switch gears again one last time, because I think it's really interesting how this worked out. I read Motown, Music, Money, Sex, and Power. And what struck me about the story of Motown, as you tell it, is how this was a family enterprise that repeated the family history. Berry Gordy, he had issues with his father in adolescence. It's a huge family with a family store and a family business. And he keeps coming back to family for connections, for resources. He starts up Motown. He makes the place into one big happy family. And then the authoritarian father in the large family dynamic happens again. Marvin Gaye called it the loving Gestapo. I thought that was just a really neat detail. And then everyone's bed hopping, so the family metaphor maybe gets a bit literal. But then in succeeding, Motown stops being a family and becomes a corporation. The patriarch fades away on a river of gold, and the company becomes a different place. And then, like all big family sagas, there are a lot of lawsuits. And then here come the Jackson Five. Woo! So you have myths being constructed around Berry Gordy and Hitsville and the mob, like they're part of the mob family. It's Detroit. And he kind of courts this image of a tough guy, but he's not a real mobster. And the result is there are conspiracy theories that you have to debunk in this book. So tell the listeners about that.
It's so fantastic, because when I started Motown, I thought it would be a break from, we just finished the King assassination. Tricia works with me on the book projects. Only one of our names goes on the front of the book, depending on what it is. But we said, let's do something that's not as controversial. And at Motown, I'd loved it for years. It had a cast of characters that nobody could imagine. It didn't have lawyers and agents in between. It was really Gordy's story of how he was able, with these people from Stevie Wonder to the Supremes to Marvin Gaye, an amazing group of people, sell black music to white America at a time when it had not been done and become one of the most successful sort of iconic labels in American history. Tricia said to me, oh, you're probably going to find out, knowing you, that Stevie Wonder was lip syncing or something, and people will be furious at you forever. It wasn't that. The discovery I made instead was debunking a conspiracy. You're absolutely right. And the conspiracy was that stuck to Gordy. Gordy had this amazing success, and there were complaints later about royalties and payments and, like you said, lawsuits. But nobody can deny the impact of the label and what he put together and how he created those young stars. The people then started to take away the credit for him and said, you know what? It really wasn't a result of Gordy doing it. It was the mafia. Gordy was an inveterate gambler, which he was. He liked to gamble. There were stories about him being in debt, that he and the mob had come in and paid off his debt with a loan shark, and then they took a part of Motown, and that some of the people, one of the big salespeople there was of Sicilian ancestry that fueled it. And so the story began. It was a mobbed-up enterprise. The mafia made Motown, and they owned Gordy. And I looked into that because that's a big story. It's been mentioned in the music business and articles in the tabloid press. If you could prove that, as a serious journalist doing the full history of Motown, that's news. And in the process of investigating that thoroughly, I came to the conclusion that's absolutely junk. It's not true at all. Not to say that he's not a gambler, not to say he didn't have debts, but Motown was not mobbed up. I did discover, I have a chapter in there called Suitcases of Cash, about how the sales department ripped off the artists. That was new. Might not be a surprise to everybody. but it was not controlled by the mafia. I never heard from Gordy after the book was published. He wouldn't cooperate when I was doing the book, but I'm sure that somewhere he must have been relieved that in the debunking of conspiracies, the one that I debunked on Motown was the fact that it was a product of the mafia. It wasn't. It was a product of Gordy's own willingness to take a chance with a group of young artists that end up coming in that is hard to replicate in terms of their quality over a period of time. And you're right, from Michael Jackson and the Jackson Five at the end to what we have with the Temptations and Stevie Wonder and Marvin Gaye. It's a rather remarkable group.
Gerald Posner, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a really broad and fun interview.
What I liked so much about your questions, Matt, is that you sort of move seamlessly from, gender to Kennedy to 9/11 to Motown. Not necessarily easy to do, but I love the breadth of that. I mean, as a journalist, I don't stay in the same area. I try to go onto a topic I know very little about, and that's easy to do. There are plenty of topics I know very little about, and then spend a long time in learning everything I can about it, and then writing about it. I like that diversity, if you want to use that word, which is often overused, of subject matters. And I love it when I occasionally get someone like you who knows the material, you're well versed in it, you've covered it yourself in terms of reporting, and you've read it, and you're able to jump around, and we touched on a lot. So thank you for the interview.
Thank you for listening to the full podcast. The Distance is an encampment for everyone made politically homeless by gender ideology. Visit our website at www.thedistancemag.com to support our work with a monthly or annual premium subscription.